In the final years of World War II, Japan's high command received a series of intelligence reports that defied belief. American scientists, they were told, were testing rockets, massive, unguided fire-spewing machines that could someday change warfare forever. At first, Japanese commanders laughed. America, experimenting with rockets? Impossible, they thought. But soon, what began as rumors turned into a terrifying reality, one that hinted that the war of the future had already begun. In secret. It was the year 1944. Across the Pacific, Japan's empire was shrinking fast. The once proud Imperial Navy was bleeding ships at an unsustainable rate. American forces were capturing island after island. Tarawa, the Marshalls, Saipan. Every loss brought the U.S. closer to Japan's home islands. But while the world focused on the ferocious battles in the Pacific, something extraordinary was happening thousands of miles away, deep within the deserts of New Mexico and California. Hidden among the sands and mountains, a small group of engineers, scientists, and military officers were working on secret projects the world wasn't supposed to know about. They weren't building planes or tanks. They were building rockets. Their goal was simple yet audacious: to push the limits of propulsion and weaponry, to turn experimental technology into tools of war. These projects were so classified that only a handful of generals even knew they existed. And while the Manhattan Project would later steal the headlines, these other experiments were quietly shaping the dawn of the missile age. The story begins in California's Mojave Desert, where the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, had its origins, not as a NASA facility, but as a wartime testing ground. In 1936, a group of Caltech engineers, young, reckless dreamers, started experimenting with rocket engines. They called themselves the Suicide Squad because their early prototypes had a habit of exploding on the launch pad. By the time America entered World War II, these scientists were working with the U.S. Army Air Corps, trying to develop jet-assisted takeoff rockets, small boosters that could help heavily loaded bombers take off from short runways. The project was named JATO, Jet-Assisted Takeoff. It didn't sound glamorous, but for the Japanese, when intelligence reports mentioned American rocket aircraft, the implications were alarming. Japan's military analysts began wondering, what kind of rockets were these? Simple boosters? Or something far more dangerous? In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Army's Technical Bureau received intercepted communications hinting that America was experimenting with liquid-fueled rockets. Reports from captured Allied pilots, newspaper clippings smuggled through neutral countries, and scattered spy data painted a confusing picture. Rocket planes, pilotless bombs, jet boosters. At first, Japan's senior commanders dismissed it as propaganda. Japan itself had been experimenting with rocket-propelled aircraft, most famously the Kawasaki Ki-200 Shusui, a copy of the German Me-163 Comet. They believed that if anyone was leading in rocket warfare, it was Germany, and by extension, Japan through its Axis alliance. But by mid-1944, scattered reports reached the Japanese naval attachés in Switzerland and Sweden. Allied research into rocket artillery and propulsion had accelerated dramatically. One particular message sent a chill through the Japanese intelligence community. American Army engineers have developed small experimental rockets capable of reaching 70,000 feet. That sounded absurd. No aircraft in the world could reach such altitude reliably at that time. And yet, the Americans had the resources, the minds, and the obsession with technology to make it happen. Meanwhile, in the United States, secret testing continued under the direction of the Army Ordnance Department. These experiments laid the foundation for what would become guided missiles, sounding rockets, and even space travel. One of the most mysterious of these early efforts was Project ORDCIT, Ordnance CIT, a partnership between Caltech and the U.S. Army. They were experimenting with long-range rockets powered by liquid fuels, precursors to the weapons that would dominate the Cold War. Every test was a mix of brilliance and danger. Early prototypes often detonated seconds after ignition, showering fragments across the desert. but each failure brought them closer to success. Few people outside the project knew the details. Even some military brass were kept in the dark. The secrecy was so tight that when Japanese intelligence later tried to piece it together, all they could find were fragments, enough to cause alarm, but not enough to reveal the full picture. In early 1945, Japanese intelligence intercepted a curious piece of American radio traffic. It referred to a bumper test, something combining a V-2 rocket with another stage on top. They were stunned. America had not only captured German rocket technology from Europe, but was already improving it. The implications were devastating. The Japanese military had assumed Germany's V weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile, were the peak of wartime rocketry. Now, it appeared America was leapfrogging even that. One internal Japanese Navy report described the fear bluntly. If America perfects these rocket weapons, no fleet or city will be safe, even across the ocean. To the Japanese High Command, this wasn't just science, it was a nightmare. They had built their empire on control of the seas, on aircraft carriers and naval strategy. But rockets didn't need oceans. They didn't even need pilots. What Japan didn't know was that the Americans' rocket work was still mostly experimental, nothing ready for battlefield use. But the foundation was being laid for something far greater. Those scientists in the desert, the same men who called themselves the Suicide Squad, were unknowingly building the stepping stones to the space age. And while Japan's commanders in 1945 couldn't fully grasp it, their intelligence fears were prophetic. The very rocket projects they once dismissed would, within just a decade, put humanity into orbit. In the desperate final months of the war, as Japan prepared for invasion and America planned its final blows, the race for rocket technology became a hidden front, one not fought with bullets, but with blueprints, experiments, and dangerous dreams. The Japanese commanders who first laughed at the idea of American rockets would soon realize the joke was on them. By 1944, the Pacific War had turned into a fight of attrition. Japan's naval power was shattered, its air force was stretched thin, and the Americans were advancing relentlessly. But far from the blood and sand of the island battles, another kind of war was being fought, one of science, secrecy, and the future of warfare itself. While Japan's commanders were still relying on traditional weapons and kamikaze tactics, American engineers were unlocking something new: the power of rockets and jet propulsion. It was the beginning of a technological revolution that no one in Tokyo could have fully imagined. The seeds of America's rocket programs were planted long before Pearl Harbor. In the 1930s, while Europe raced ahead with rocket clubs and military research, most U.S. generals dismissed the technology as science fiction. That changed in 1939, when a young physicist named Theodore von Karman, along with a group of Caltech engineers, began developing rocket boosters to help overloaded bombers lift off from short Pacific runways. Their experiments were funded quietly by the Army Air Corps, and later by the Army Ordnance Department. These early rockets were not weapons yet. They were meant to give planes more thrust during takeoff. But the principles behind them, liquid fuels, thrust chambers, and ignition control, would soon form the backbone of America's wartime propulsion research. By 1942, the Jet Assisted Takeoff Project, or JATO, had already succeeded. American B-24 bombers were taking off from short strips with the help of small rocket bottles attached to their wings. The technology worked. It was simple, effective, and revolutionary. And yet, what came next was even more ambitious. Von Karman and his team believed rockets could go far beyond helping planes. They could replace them entirely. Among the JATO pioneers was a young engineer named Frank Molina. Along with a fiery graduate student named Jack Parsons, Molina dreamed of one day reaching space. They called their group the Suicide Squad, because every test run risked explosion, and many did. Their crude test engines would often blow apart seconds after ignition, hurling debris across the desert. But despite the chaos, progress came quickly. Each blast brought new data, and each failure brought refinement. Soon, Molina's team began working on larger, more powerful liquid-fueled engines. Their new project, named Private A, was the U.S. Army's first true attempt at a vertical launch rocket, a direct step toward missiles. By 1944, they had built and successfully launched small test rockets that reached altitudes no artillery shell could match. The Army was impressed, and more importantly, interested. Behind the scenes, whispers began circulating through American intelligence and engineering circles. If we can guide it, we can weaponize it. While America's desert experiments continued, Japan's intelligence network struggled to piece together what was really happening. Their primary sources came from neutral nations, mainly Sweden and Switzerland, where diplomatic attachés could intercept Allied chatter. One such report, sent in early 1944 by a Japanese agent in Stockholm, stated, "American scientists have begun testing small rocket engines for aircraft and other vehicles. There is speculation of high-altitude testing in desert areas." To Tokyo's military leadership, it sounded like an extension of America's aircraft industry, nothing more. Japan's strategic thinking was still anchored in conventional warfare. Their scientists were experimenting with rockets too, but their focus was limited to short-range weapons, unguided rocket bombs like the Type 4 20cm rocket launcher and the Funryu surface-to-air missile. But these projects suffered from a lack of resources, materials, and reliable guidance systems. Japan's technological base was already under immense strain. Still, when intelligence officers compared their progress to American advancements, they noted something troubling. American rocket engines appear stable and efficient, fuel mixtures unknown. That final line, fuel mixtures unknown, became a point of concern. Japan's chemists couldn't identify what propellants the Americans were using. It was as if the U.S. had unlocked a new formula, one the Japanese simply couldn't replicate. While Japan's scientists struggled in isolation, America's industrial machine roared to life. Companies like Aerojet, Douglas Aircraft, and Bell Laboratories poured resources into propulsion research. In Pasadena, the newly formed Aerojet Engineering Corporation mass-produced JATO units for the U.S. Navy. By 1945, thousands of rockets were being used to help transport planes, fully loaded bombers, and even carrier-based aircraft take off safely under heavy load. Each success reinforced the U.S. belief that rocketry was the next frontier of warfare. But the real breakthrough came when America began recruiting and collaborating with scientific talent from across the world, including exiled European scientists who had fled the Nazi regime. They brought with them advanced knowledge of liquid fuel dynamics, combustion, and guidance, areas where Japan had fallen far behind. As Allied forces captured Europe in 1945, the Japanese military began receiving horrifying updates from Germany. The Allies had discovered the V-2 rocket. This 14-meter-tall missile could reach the edge of space and strike targets over 200 miles away, silently, at supersonic speeds. It was the most advanced weapon ever built. When Japan learned that American engineers were now studying captured V-2 components, panic rippled through the Imperial Navy's Research Bureau. A senior officer reportedly told his staff, "If America learns to build these rockets on its own soil, the war's future will no longer be fought on the seas or in the skies. It will be fought from beyond them." For the first time, Japan understood the true potential of America's secret experiments. What they had dismissed as harmless research was rapidly evolving into something unstoppable. Inside Japan, secrecy gave way to anxiety. Engineers scrambled to accelerate domestic rocket projects like Funryu 4, a surface-to-air missile powered by liquid oxygen and kerosene. But fuel shortages and bombing raids crippled production. Meanwhile, American testing intensified. In the deserts of New Mexico, experiments with high-altitude research rockets began under new Army programs that would later evolve into the WAC Corporal and Private F projects. These rockets could already exceed 40 miles in altitude, a staggering feat for 1945. While the Japanese military tried to decode intercepted references to high-altitude research, they couldn't confirm what the rockets were for. Were they meant for weather studies, or weapons that could reach Japan itself? The truth was simpler, but more terrifying. These tests were prototypes for a new age of warfare, a silent revolution unfolding right under their noses. As Japan's empire began to crumble, its leaders realized they were no longer just fighting America's armies, they were fighting its scientists. The Americans weren't just building weapons for this war, they were building the foundations for the next one. And soon Japan would learn that the secret rocket experiments were far more real and far more advanced than they ever imagined. By early 1945, Japan was standing on the edge of destruction. Its cities were burning, its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, and American B-29s roared overhead almost daily. Yet in the midst of this devastation, a new kind of intelligence report began to surface. One that made even Japan's most hardened generals pause in disbelief. American scientists, the report said, were no longer just building rockets. They were testing multi-stage designs capable of reaching the stratosphere, weapons that might someday cross oceans. To Japan's commanders, it sounded like madness, but the truth was far more shocking than even their fears could imagine. In March 1945, an encrypted Japanese cable from Stockholm reached the Imperial Army's Technical Bureau in Tokyo. The report, gathered by Japanese attachés through neutral Swedish industry sources, described strange activity in the deserts of the American Southwest. Military rocket testing observed. Large vertical exhaust columns, visible for miles. Object ascends rapidly beyond sight. Unconfirmed altitude exceeds 200,000 feet. That number, 200,000 feet, was so outrageous that Japan's scientists dismissed it as a translation error. It implied a rocket reaching nearly 40 miles high, higher than any plane or artillery shell could ever go. But this was no error. It was a reference to America's WAC Corporal test series, small, slim rockets built by the Army Ordnance and Caltech teams as part of Project ORD-SIT. These rockets were designed to explore high-altitude flight, but they also served another purpose: to understand how a missile could survive launch, re-entry, and extreme temperature variations. When the Japanese High Command reviewed the intelligence summary, they were stunned. If the reports were even half true, it meant the Americans were not only experimenting with rockets, they were already learning how to send them into space. The truth was hidden behind the fences of White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. Established in 1945, it became the nerve center for all American long-range rocket testing. The base was a desolate sea of sand and sun, perfect for secrecy. Here, the U.S. Army began launching captured German V-2 rockets under Operation Hermes. But before the Germans' missiles even arrived, American prototypes like Private F and WAC Corporal were already proving the concept. These tests didn't remain secret for long. Japanese intelligence units operating through Europe caught wind of them through German sources. In one surviving wartime memo sent to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, a Japanese attaché in Berlin wrote, "The Americans have captured German rocket facilities intact and are already reproducing components in their own laboratories." That revelation sent shockwaves through the Japanese High Command. The V-2 had terrified London and Antwerp, a weapon that struck from the edge of the atmosphere, impossible to intercept. If America now possessed that technology, Japan's vulnerability was complete. By this point, Tokyo was being burned to ashes by B-29 firebomb raids. The nation's anti-air defenses were ineffective, fuel was scarce, and radar coverage was patchy. But the mere possibility of America possessing long-range rockets terrified Japan's strategists even more. What if the next phase of the war brought missiles instead of bombers? What if rockets could be launched from submarines or far-off bases without warning? One Imperial Navy intelligence officer wrote in his confidential notes, "Bombers can be shot down, but a rocket leaves no warning. If such a weapon is perfected, Japan will have no defense." The irony, of course, was that America had no such weapon ready for combat, not yet. But the Japanese didn't know that. Their fear was born of incomplete information, whispers, and their own realization that they could never match America's industrial and scientific momentum. In May 1945, as Okinawa fell, new intelligence from neutral Switzerland added fuel to the fire. Japanese agents there obtained an American engineering journal that briefly mentioned new rocket research stations in California and New Mexico. Though the article was vague, it confirmed what the Japanese feared most, that the US military's rocket projects were expanding rapidly and might already have been linked to the country's top universities. Desperate to verify this, Japan's Naval Technical Bureau cross-referenced known American scientists from before the war, and noticed names like von Karman, Molina, and Parsons reappearing in government-funded projects. The realization was grim. The same scientists who had begun by studying jet takeoffs were now working on guided missiles. One internal Japanese analysis, recovered after the war, summarized it with chilling accuracy. The United States, unopposed by air raids, will quickly surpass German achievements in rocketry. They will use their industrial power to make rockets not in tens, but in thousands. At the same moment, Japan was drowning in fear. Across the Pacific, American scientists were celebrating milestones that would change history. At White Sands, engineers successfully launched a WAC Corporal rocket atop a V-2 booster, creating the world's first two-stage rocket, nicknamed Bumper WAC. The rocket reached an altitude of nearly 400,000 feet, higher than any human-made object had ever gone. The achievement was stunning. It proved that multi-stage rockets could break the atmosphere, a principle that would eventually send satellites and astronauts into space. But in 1945, it had another meaning. It showed that America could now produce rockets far beyond Germany's wartime limits. None of this was known publicly, of course. The tests were classified, the reports hidden. Yet through fragmented intelligence, the Japanese sensed that something unprecedented was happening, and they were powerless to stop it. By the summer of 1945, Japan's morale was collapsing. Every week brought new defeats and strange rumors, a new superweapon being tested by the United States. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but those whispers referred not only to the atomic bomb, but to the ongoing rocket and missile programs developing in tandem. One officer from Japan's 6th Army recorded in his diary, after hearing intercepted broadcasts about massive explosions in the desert southwest, "Perhaps these are rockets. If they can strike across the Pacific, our cities will vanish overnight." In a sense, this was true. Not yet, but soon. The future of warfare was being written in those deserts. While Japan's young pilots were giving their lives in kamikaze missions, America was building laboratories, assembling test stands, and running equations. The contrast was staggering. One nation was burning its youth, the other was harnessing its intellect. And in that race, Japan had already lost. As the war neared its terrible end, American rocket tests reached new heights. And Japanese commanders began to realize the horrifying truth. They had been fighting yesterday's war, while America had already stepped into tomorrow's. The skies over Japan burned with B-29 firestorms, but far beyond those clouds, another kind of fire was being born. The fire of propulsion, precision, and progress. And when the war finally ended, Japan would discover just how far America's secret rocket experiments had already come, and how close they had been to changing warfare forever. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most desperate stage. Japan's empire was collapsing, its navy was gone, and its skies were ruled by American bombers. But even as Tokyo burned, the Japanese High Command remained haunted by one question. What was America building in its deserts? They had heard the rumors, rockets that could reach the edge of space, missiles that could be launched across oceans. They didn't yet know how close those rumors were to the truth, or how those secret tests would shape the post-war world. When Allied forces captured Germany, they uncovered a technological treasure chest unlike anything ever seen. Hidden deep in underground tunnels at Nordhausen and Peenemünde, the Allies discovered hundreds of completed V-2 rockets, along with thousands of blueprints, components, and scientific notes. The Japanese knew of the V-2's existence through German reports, but even they were stunned at the scale of what the Americans found. Intelligence documents from late 1945 mention the Japanese attaché in Berlin sending one final desperate cable. V-2 production captured intact. American troops transferring engineers to unknown locations. Advise prepare for new type of long-range warfare. That unknown location was White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. In the months after Germany's surrender, the United States launched Operation Hermes, a top-secret effort to transport V-2 components and German scientists to American soil. The program was managed by the Army Ordnance Corps, and its mission was simple: to study, rebuild, and improve the German rocket. What followed marked the true beginning of America's missile era. The first V-2 launch from U.S. soil took place in April 1946 at White Sands. It soared over 100 miles high, a success that stunned even the scientists watching from the ground. Though Japan had already surrendered by then, the seeds of this operation had been sown during the final months of the war. Japanese intelligence had predicted this transfer before it even began. They were right. The Americans were inheriting Germany's greatest weapon. Even before their surrender, Japan had been scrambling to build rockets of its own. The Imperial Navy and Army both initiated separate programs in a desperate attempt to match German technology. One such program was the Funryu series, Japan's first attempt at guided surface-to-air missiles. The Funryu 4, designed in 1945, was meant to intercept high-flying B-29s using liquid-fueled propulsion, a mix of kerosene and liquid oxygen, similar to the German Me-163's technology. But Japan faced impossible odds. Fuel was scarce, aluminum and steel were rationed. Power plants had been bombed to ruins, and with constant air raids, even basic testing became dangerous. At one facility near Fukui, engineers managed a few short test burns before the prototype was destroyed in an air raid. The project was abandoned shortly after. In one surviving technical memo, a frustrated engineer wrote, "We are trying to build weapons of tomorrow while fighting with the tools of yesterday." That single sentence captured the tragedy of Japan's scientific struggle: vision without resources, innovation without time. While Japan's laboratories burned, America's were expanding. The California Institute of Technology, Aerojet Engineering, and the newly designated White Sands Proving Ground were all working at breakneck speed. By late 1945, Caltech's engineers had successfully launched Private F, WAC Corporal, and Tiny Tim rockets, each improving upon propulsion, stability, and altitude. At White Sands, captured V-2s were being rebuilt and launched regularly under American supervision. Each launch brought new insights: aerodynamic control, fuel efficiency, guidance systems. What the Germans had begun under duress, the Americans were now perfecting with vast resources. And overseeing it all were scientists who would soon become legendary, men like Werner von Braun, the German engineer who had built the V-2 for Hitler, but now found himself working under the U.S. Army. For the Japanese, who later learned of these developments through post-war intelligence briefings, it was nothing short of unbelievable. America, a nation they had once thought technologically behind Europe, was now leading the world into the age of rocketry. During the last months of 1945, before the official surrender, a small circle within Japan's military scientific community finally pieced the puzzle together. An intercepted Allied broadcast mentioned upper atmospheric studies using rocket propulsion. Combined with earlier intelligence about high-altitude experiments, it led Japan's Navy analysts to a grim conclusion. The United States is developing a weapon capable of reaching beyond aircraft range. If perfected, this will render all conventional defenses obsolete. They didn't know it, but they had just predicted the dawn of the ballistic missile. By that point, Japan's own rocket projects were effectively dead. With factories destroyed and communication lines shattered, their scientists could only imagine what was happening in those distant American deserts. After the surrender, when Japanese scientists were shown Allied footage of American rocket launches, real test films captured by newsreels, they were stunned into silence. One Japanese officer reportedly muttered, "So, they were building this while we sent our boys in planes made of wood. It was not mockery. It was grief, a recognition of how far behind they had truly fallen. The story of America's secret rocket experiments didn't end with Japan's surrender. It was only beginning. The U.S. government soon initiated Operation Paperclip, bringing over hundreds of German rocket scientists, including von Braun's entire team, to work under American military contracts. Their goal: transform wartime rocketry into peacetime dominance. Under their guidance, the V-2 became the foundation for the Redstone missile, which later evolved into the Jupiter and Atlas rockets, the very systems that would carry nuclear warheads and astronauts alike. What began as a secret project in the California desert during World War II had now evolved into a global arms race, and Japan, once a world power, found itself on the outside, watching in astonishment as the very technology it had dismissed as fantasy became the new face of power. In post-war interviews conducted by U.S. occupation forces, several Japanese officers reflected on what they had learned about America's rocket work. One former naval scientist said, "We thought America's power was in its factories and carriers. We never understood that its true weapon was its science." Another, more bluntly, remarked, "We feared the bombers, but it was the rockets that showed us we were already fighting the next century NS war." For Japan, the lesson was clear. Wars were no longer decided by bravery or numbers, but by knowledge. By the end of 1945, the world had changed forever. The Americans had inherited Germany's rocket secrets, mastered propulsion beyond anything imagined, and set their eyes on the stars. The Japanese commanders, who once scoffed at rumors of America's secret rockets, would soon see the truth, not in the skies over Tokyo, but in the terrifying new balance of power that emerged after the war. And when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, it wasn't just the power of destruction that shocked Japan. It was the realization that science itself had become the ultimate weapon. August 1945. The world stood still. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruins, and Japan's leaders finally accepted the inevitable. Yet even as the emperor prepared to surrender, another storm was brewing in the shadows, a storm of technology, secrecy, and power. For the first time, Japanese commanders began to see the full scale of America's scientific war machine. The atomic bomb had ended the war, but America's other weapon, its rockets, hinted at a future that would forever change humanity's understanding of warfare itself. When Japan's surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, the country was paralyzed by shock. The atomic bombings had shown a weapon of unimaginable destruction. But as American occupation forces arrived, Japanese military scientists were confronted by something equally unbelievable. The documents, blueprints, and prototypes of America's wartime rocket research. Teams from the U.S. Army Air Forces and naval technical missions began systematically visiting Japanese research facilities, inspecting everything from aircraft to propulsion labs. In exchange, they revealed glimpses of what had been developed in America. Japanese engineers who had struggled to build small, unstable rockets suddenly saw photographs and film reels of American test flights. Whack corporals, Private F, Tiny Tims, and the bumper whack reaching the stratosphere. One scientist, a propulsion engineer from the Imperial Navy's Yokosuka Laboratory, recalled years later, "When they showed us their rocket footage, we thought it was a trick film. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. We were still trying to stabilize a 1-meter rocket, and they were sending theirs into space." For the Japanese scientific community, it was an awakening and a humiliation. The myth that America was a nation of industrial workers, not thinkers, had been shattered forever. As Japan lay under Allied occupation, the Americans began documenting the technology race that had raged behind closed doors. Declassified records revealed that throughout 1944-45, the U.S. Army had poured millions into experimental rockets, not only for aircraft assistance, but also for research into guided missiles and long-range bombardment. At China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station, engineers had already developed air-to-ground and ship-launched rockets capable of targeting enemy positions with stunning accuracy. And at White Sands, the United States was transitioning from experimental models to true ballistic designs, with V-2 components now fully integrated into American-made test vehicles. The Japanese had long believed that only Germany had the scientific culture to create such machines. But the war had proven otherwise. America had not only caught up, it had surpassed even Germany's vision. In early 1946, as part of a post-war intelligence exchange, Japanese scientists were shown footage of the bumper whack rocket. When they learned it had reached nearly 400,000 feet, some refused to believe it. Others realized with dread that the implications were enormous. One Japanese physicist wrote in his diary, "The Americans have learned to leave the Earth. We fought with iron and fuel, but they fight with the universe." While Japan mourned the loss of millions, across the Pacific, a quiet revolution was underway. Men like Theodore von Karman, Frank Malina, and Jack Parsons, the pioneers of wartime propulsion, were now the architects of a new future. Von Karman became the chief scientific advisor to the U.S. Air Force, laying the groundwork for missile development and later, spaceflight. Parsons co-founded Aerojet, helping the U.S. military mass-produce reliable rocket boosters. And Malina's YC Corporal program evolved into America's first scientific rocket to cross the edge of space. Together, their wartime experiments created a lineage that stretched from JATO to NASA, from the Pacific battlefields to the moon itself. For Japan, this transformation was staggering. A nation that once dominated Asia with naval power now watched as America prepared to dominate the heavens. In 1946, during occupation briefings, Japanese commanders were told of America's ongoing rocket research and the new alliances forming in Europe. What stunned them most wasn't the size of America's rockets. It was the speed of progress. Within months of the war's end, the U.S. military had repurposed captured German V-2s for scientific research, launching them with American modifications. By 1948, these rockets were carrying instruments to measure cosmic radiation and upper atmospheric pressure, data that would one day be used for missile guidance. To Japan's former generals, it was a revelation. America hadn't merely won the war, it had rewritten the very definition of warfare. In a debriefing later translated for Allied archives, one Japanese general admitted, "We thought industrial power was America's advantage, but its true strength was its faith in discovery. We had courage, but they had curiosity, and curiosity won." Those words became one of the most striking post-war reflections from any Japanese officer, a quiet recognition that the age of steel and gunpowder had ended, replaced by the age of science. While Japan rebuilt under occupation, the U.S. turned its wartime rocket programs into a foundation for something much larger. In 1950, the first bumper whack rocket was launched from Cape Canaveral, the same site that would later send men to the moon. The two-stage rocket reached 250 miles in altitude and speeds of over 5,000 miles per hour. It was the ultimate validation of those secret World War II experiments. In Tokyo, Japanese scientists studying in American universities would later watch the footage in awe. The very projects that Japan's commanders once laughed off as impossible were now the engines of humanity's next leap forward. By the early 1950s, Japan had accepted a new identity, no longer a military empire but a nation rebuilding through technology and peace. Ironically, it was inspired by the same scientific spirit it once underestimated. In the years to come, Japan would join the United States in peaceful research, developing its own space program, a symbolic transformation born from the ashes of disbelief. But for those who had led Japan during the war, the memories of those secret American rocket experiments lingered. They had seen how knowledge could outweigh armies, how quiet laboratories could decide the fate of nations. One admiral reportedly said in a 1951 interview, "The Americans built the future while we were busy defending the past." He wasn't wrong. The secret rocket experiments that once seemed like wild rumors became the foundation of the modern world. What began as desert tests in California and New Mexico would propel humanity into orbit and eventually to the stars. For the Japanese commanders who once doubted it, America's rockets were more than a weapon. They were a warning. The wars of the future would not be fought by fleets or fortresses, but by minds bold enough to dream of the impossible. The war had ended, the flags of surrender had been raised, and the cities lay in silence. Yet beneath the ashes of Tokyo, and in the laboratories of America's southwest deserts, a new kind of war had already begun. One that wasn't fought with bullets, but with equations, fuel mixtures, and the limitless reach of imagination. For Japan, the shock of defeat wasn't only military, it was intellectual. They hadn't just lost to America's industry, they had lost to America's ability to dream bigger, faster, and higher than anyone thought possible. In the years immediately after 1945, American rocket scientists, many of whom had started their work in secrecy during the war, were now national heroes. Projects that had been classified under code names like Private F, WAC Corporal, and Aerojet Experimental were now stepping stones to something humanity had never seen: spaceflight. The same launch pads that once fired weapons of war were now launching instruments of exploration. The U.S. Army's White Sands Proving Ground, once used to test missile components, was becoming the cradle of the American space program. In 1949, the bumper whack reached 250 miles in altitude, higher than any man-made object before it. To the Japanese scientists who saw that footage years later, it felt like witnessing a new dawn. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that America's secret rocket experiments were not merely about winning a war. They were about conquering the future. While America accelerated into the space age, Japan began its own quiet transformation. Its scientists, once forced to serve imperial war goals, were now free to explore peaceful research. Under the U.S. occupation reforms, many of Japan's surviving engineers were invited to study abroad. They visited places like Caltech, MIT, and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the same institutions that had powered America's wartime rocket breakthroughs. And they returned home changed. By the 1950s, Japan began establishing its own space science programs. Institutions like the Institute of Space and Astronautical Science, ISS, which would later merge into JAXA, Japan's modern space agency, were founded by scientists who had once stood in awe of America's wartime rocket footage. The nation that once saw the rocket as a weapon now saw it as a symbol of progress, proof that technology could lift a country higher than conquest ever could. It wasn't until decades later that the full truth of America's wartime rocket experiments began to surface. Declassified reports revealed that by 1943, the U.S. already had more than 300 rocket research projects running simultaneously, from jet-assisted takeoff, JTOW systems, to guided munitions and early ballistic concepts. And many of these programs were deeply intertwined with academic institutions, places that blended theoretical physics with practical engineering. This was America's true secret. It had weaponized innovation itself. While Japan's military hierarchy had suppressed or redirected scientific curiosity toward rigid military doctrine, the U.S. had done the opposite. It had nurtured that curiosity, allowing scientists to experiment freely, fail repeatedly, and dream beyond the limits of the battlefield. By the time Japan realized this, the world had changed forever. Ironically, Japan's defeat laid the foundation for its eventual technological triumphs. In the decades following the war, Japan became one of the world's leading nations in precision engineering, robotics, and aerospace research. And in 1970, just 25 years after the surrender, Japan launched its first satellite, Osumi, into orbit, using its own rocket. When footage of that launch reached American scientists who had once demonstrated their wartime rockets to Japanese engineers, some reportedly smiled and said, "They didn't just learn from defeat, they learned how to rise." It was the ultimate twist of history. The nation that once doubted the power of rockets now soared among the stars. But here's something that still surprises historians today. Recently declassified Imperial Army documents reveal that Japan had begun small-scale rocket experiments late in the war, mostly crude prototypes for air defense and anti-submarine use. At one point, A secret Imperial Navy project called Funryu-2, an early surface-to-air missile, was being tested using solid-fuel boosters. But the program never progressed far. Resources were scarce, and time had run out. Had the war lasted just 1 or 2 more years, Japan might have deployed operational guided rockets, though nowhere near the scale of America's advancements. Still, it shows that both nations were racing toward the same horizon. One just got there first. And that difference changed the world. As the Cold War unfolded, America's wartime rocket experiments became the backbone of its Intercontinental Ballistic Missile (ICBM) program, and later, NASA's space launches. Meanwhile, Japan rebuilt itself into a nation defined not by conquest, but by creativity. In a sense, both countries' destinies were shaped by those secret rockets, one through victory, the other through realization. Today, when a Japanese HIA rocket lifts off from Tanegashima Space Center, it carries with it a legacy born from disbelief, the disbelief of commanders who once thought rockets were science fiction. In the end, the war for the Pacific was not only fought on the seas or in the skies, it was fought in the minds of those who dared to innovate. America's rockets were not merely weapons, they were messages, written in flame, that said, progress will always outlast destruction. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, that the tools of war can become the engines of peace, and that the disbelief of one generation can become the inspiration of the next. The Japanese commanders who once couldn't believe America's secret rocket experiments could never have imagined that one day their own nation would be reaching for the stars alongside the very country they once fought against. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most astonishing technological stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are countless forgotten tales of World War II, stories of innovation, courage, and discovery waiting to be told. Until next time, remember, in history, disbelief often precedes destiny.